This was posited by one of my professors once, writing professors, and he said there are three basic archetypes when it comes to genre fiction. So anything science fiction, fantasy, horror, something like that. And these are going to sound like, I'm going to say these three names and you're going to think, wait a minute, what about X, Y, and Z? And X, Y, and Z, they fit into these. Let me get through them. These are kind of big umbrella terms that fit a lot. And I've tweaked this a little bit myself. As I said, I'm still not 100% married to it, but I do like where it's going. So once I do finish pinning it down myself, maybe it'll end up in the archetype book. Maybe one day we'll see. I'll get to it. So, three basic types of characters, and these are other than humans. So you've got humans in genre fiction quite a bit, obviously, but your non-human characters. You have your monsters, your aliens, and your machines. Again, you're probably thinking of a lot of types that maybe don't sound like they fit in those three, but just bear with me. Let me define them because these are, like I said, broad, flexible terms. Monsters are any kind of monstrous character. So we'll use the classic monsters just as examples. But monsters do come from the id. It doesn't have to be horror. I mean, there are plenty of science fiction novels or stories that have the quote-unquote monster in it. There are fantasy novels that have the monster in it. I would argue that Shelob, from Lord of the Rings was a monster, with her hunger and such. So the idea of a monster, it comes from, Freud called it the id. Jung would call it the collective unconscious, or even maybe the personal unconscious or subconscious. But the monster is, and you can go into the monster. These are broad archetypes, so we could go into sub-archetypes quite a bit. But the monster is any part of humanity that we would rather not come to the forefront and have control. Doesn't matter if you're the purest person in the world, the most kindest, compassionate, charitable person in the world that's writing this. You have to, as a writer, tap in to that part of your mind just as a human being, not necessarily your part as an individual and things you might, like to do, but you just don't or whatever. But, just as a human being, that collective unconscious, that id, you tap into at least an archetype from it. You can't access the whole thing or the actual thing, but you can access the archetypes that show up over and over again, which are symbols of things that do come from that area of our psychology. So you have to find that human evil. And this is the overarching theme about all of these types that I'm going to talk about, is that each one is an element of humanity. As human beings, we are incapable of writing or creating any character that's not really human in some way. And I mean that underneath the surface. Obviously, we can create different monsters, different alien beings, different non-carbon-based life forms or something if you want. But the only frame of reference you have as a writer is humanity, because that's all you know. You're a human. So all of these characters have to be some sort of reflection of humanity. And if you embrace that, and if you do it right, then the readers know what you're talking about, and the readers will relate to it. They will respond to that aspect of humanity that you're pulling out. So I'll give you some examples. Let's just use vampires first, because vampires, there's a variety of different vampires you see in fiction. There's the monstrous vampire, the Dracula vampire, the ones who have renounce their humanity, and that's what makes them monstrous. They're still human enough to make the decision. They kind of their monstrosity is that they're existing within that decision to renounce their humanity and embrace the evil, to embrace the victimizing people, and being the predator and stuff like that. So that's a very monstrous being. Then you've got vampires, though. Think of like Louis in Interview with the Vampire, who are desperately trying to retain some level of humanity or hold on to their humanity. And that appeals to us as well if you're using a character like that as a protagonist, because we know what it's like to not think very fondly of the things we do or the things we've done in the past, and to feel like, we're just really trying to hold on to our humanity in some level or something like that. Again, same even specific monster here, but you can make them totally monstrous, hold on to their humanity a bit. And you can do all kinds of different things with that. I mean, you look at vampires just in particular, and we'll get to other monsters here in a second. But you look at vampires throughout the history and the ways that they've been portrayed. In Bram Stoker's time, Dracula was a monster, but you also had this sort of latent, I mean, this was the Victorian era. I think it's safe to say Victorian era was extremely repressed. Not that we want to see it, going crazy like the 60s and the hippies in the 60s or anything, but culture was extremely repressed to the point where you couldn't even talk about certain things, certain issues. So you all suddenly have this novel come out, and it's about this man who enters this woman's bedchamber at night, and he needs to see her flesh uncovered, her neck, right? He needs to see that. When he sees that, he becomes physically excited to the point where his fangs extend, and then he bites her neck, and there's this exchange of fluids and everything, and you don't have to be a genius to see the sexual undertones to that. So using something like the monster, even a monster who's truly monstrous, like Dracula, who's rejected his humanity, playing on different elements of humanity. So there's that. And then, of course, nowadays you've got the vampires we're going crazy with that, like with the Twilight stuff or True Blood and all of that. And there's still the forbidden romance aspects to those, as we go through those. You can do a bunch of different things with that. But taking a being who's not supposed to be human anymore, a vampire who's technically lost their humanity, or either tries to grab it, and tries to retain it, and then you're showing forth elements of humanity with that. Certainly werewolves, we talked about that during Monstober. Again, they can either embrace what they do, or they can, most likely, that you got the pathos of them feeling bad about what they do when they lose control, when they do give in to the id during the full moon and such. But you see how each of these monsters we talk about, their monstrosity, or what they do with it at whatever level, is related to their humanity. And that is as we as readers would respond to that. So ghosts, you've got ghosts who refuse to admit what's happened to them. They refuse to admit that they're no longer human, quote unquote, in the way that, an embodied person would be. And then the ultimate monster, or even if it's not this specific type of monster, but any kind of monster, the ultimate is the one who's lost all humanity. Not even like Dracula, not even like a vampire or a monster who's existing within that decision to reject their humanity, because there's still one level of humanity left to that, in the fact that they reject it. And Dracula is very logical, and he's very a logical predator. He's an Apollonian character and whatnot. So there's at least a shred of humanity in that. The most monstrous monster you could think of is one who's completely lost all humanity, which would be a zombie, right? The mindless monster, ghoul or whatever coming at you, who wants to eat your brains, right? Because they've lost their brains logically, and that's part of that mythos, part of that story as it evolved. So once you understand the kind of archetypes that you're using, and we'll go through the other ones here in a second, but one of the things, it's so important to understand the nature of these archetypes in your work, whether you're writing science fiction, horror, fantasy, or whatever, because then what this archetype or what this type of character, whether it's a monster in this part or another, what it does for readers, what it does for the humanity of readers. And you also you can get an idea of what's the best time to release some of these stories. Monsters, for example, certain monsters just have historically done well or done better at different times of history. Zombies, for example, even if you dated all the way back to Frankenstein, which was a type of zombie, a type of reanimated flesh, it's a different kind. It's not like the Walking Dead or something like that. But those types of stories always come about whenever society as a whole is a little unsure about our scientific progress. We don't know if we're playing God or not. So you've seen that obviously in Mary Shelley's day. You had medical school students stealing bodies just so they could actually have some hands-on experience, and do autopsies and whatnot. And that was very much frowned upon. Ben Franklin was even involved in that when he was in Britain. They've excavated his home that he lived in over there when he was ambassador to Britain, and found like bones and bodies and stuff, because he was actually part of, he was a man of science. So he was part of that underground trying to funnel dead bodies to medical students so they would actually be able to practice and whatnot. So there was, ideas of advances in medicine and stuff. What's too far? What's playing God? And you've got this story, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, about a man who goes too far and tries to cheat death. You've got that story. Zombie stories since then have come up with scenarios like, there's this virus that we created, and it was it can't be contained, and it was humanity's fault, basically mankind's fault that they let this get out there into the world or whatever. So that's a theme that you see a lot as well. So you understand which archetype you're writing. If it's a monster, then you go into which sub archetype it is, and then you realize, okay, this is the appeal of it, what's going to appeal to my readers, and when maybe it's the best time to release something like that.